Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Faruk Rahmanovich and I am joined today by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series, we're doing a chapter by chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the West. And we'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and then delving more deeply into ideas within the passage, like what implications you can draw, conclusions you can come to, and generally showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. In today's session, we are looking at the last chapter of the text. It's part 3, so I guess technically chapter 15, even though it's the epilogue, responding to modern challenges. Alright, so what did you think of the chapter as a whole, and then where would you like to sort of hop in?
Well, in a way, it serves as a summary for everything up to this point. If you were reading everything through up to here, you would see a lot of the same themes repeated here. I think one of the big things that Nasr accomplishes in this section is breaking down into 4 main categories what are the different areas of the modern world that Muslims, especially Muslim youth, need to address. So the first one we have is religious, spiritual, and intellectual. And let's start by taking a look at some of the material in there. So let's head to page 242. Last full paragraph. He says, "It is also of the utmost importance that young Muslims come to learn more about their own intellectual tradition, embracing all the different Islamic disciplines from jurisprudence and the principles of jurisprudence to theology, philosophy, and the spiritual sciences of Sufism, not to speak of the basic disciplines of Quranic commentary and hadith. It is of course impossible for a young Muslim to master all these subjects, but it is not impossible for him or her to have a rudimentary knowledge of this intellectual tradition, so as not to feel a sense of inferiority vis-a-vis the main thrust of the challenge of the West, which is most of all in the domain of knowledge, and therefore is intellectual, if not in the authentic source of the term, at least in the sense of the rational, and that which deals with the fruits of the activity of the mind." This stands out to me, first off, because a lot of the major criticisms that Muslim youth will encounter regarding Islam will be regarding the religious aspects of the faith. You may hear someone raise a question like, well, how could you possibly know that the Quran was preserved? Or how could you possibly know that the hadith were properly transmitted down? They weren't written down for 200 years afterwards. There's a Muslim intellectual, or at least an intellectual in America with a Muslim name. I don't know whether or not he's practicing. And he works for one of these major organizations like the Cato Institute, or I think it's actually that one of those major think tank organizations. And just last week there was a big controversy with him basically saying something to that effect. The whole getting into the historicity of the hadith subject, where he was saying something to the effect of, how Muslims can't really try to make that argument when it took 200 years for the hadith to get written down, but meanwhile we know that whichever gospel it was, John or Mark, whichever one, like, oh yeah, that one started being written 50 years afterwards, so that criticism doesn't really work. And I mean, he's wrong, but do you know why he's wrong? That's the real question. Because if you don't know why he's wrong, then how are you supposed to respond to something like that? And it makes it worse that it's someone with a Muslim name saying something like that, right? Because he has some credibility being an intellectual. And maybe even Muslim youth look at someone like that and it's like, oh, but look, there are Muslims who say these kinds of things too. Like, well, what's the issue here? Not even a rudimentary level of knowledge regarding those exact subjects. How do we know that the Quran was preserved? How do we know that the hadith were preserved and passed down? And if you're lacking even that, that's where these doubts can start creeping in.
So yeah, I think that for example is a pretty solid sort of issue. I think though it gets even more basic than that. How many sort of college-age Muslims, both like as we were coming up and now, you sort of see that they have ideas about quote Islam, but like really it's ideas about the culture of Pakistan or the culture of Yemen or like whatever it is, right? And so they don't have the basic grasp on Islam as Islam. What they have is like whatever it is that they, in essence, inherited from their parents, right? It's an entire behavior set, right? And I'll give you an example that this happens in Bosnia. So in Bosnia, the common setup for prayer is that you always pray the Sunnah prayer as well, right? It's never just the Fard.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that developed in the mosques because you have the adhan, and then there's a 5-10 minute wait time, right, between the adhan and the start of the Fard prayer. And that's because you're trying to give people enough time to, get to the masjid and make wudu and get in. And so people just started praying Sunnah in that space, because if you're already there, you might as well, right? And so everybody prays a Sunnah, and then everybody together prays the Fard, and then there's the Zikr and the Tasbih that follows that, and then you're done. And now here's a funny part, right? In Bosnia, in Bosnian language, was sort of the Bosnian variant of the Slavic, because we've imported a bunch of Arabic, Turkish things into it. We understand that Sunnah is optional and that Fard is obligatory, right? That there's absolutely no question as to the meaning of those words. And yet I have met people that say things like, I don't have time to pray. And you're like, well, what do you mean? And they're like, well, by the time you pray all the Sunnah, and then, by the time you do all the Fard, and by the time you do the Tasbih, and you go like, well, hold on, you do know that Sunnah is not Fard. And they're like, yeah, but, you kind of have to pray it. And you're like, literally no. But they inherited this entire ritual set from where they came from, and at least that one isn't, it doesn't have a negative connotation in and of itself, even though it turns out that it does sort of negatively impact their ability to follow this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they think they need like a half-hour chunk every time they go to pray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
it's funny you mention that, because it must have been more than a decade ago. Noman Ali Khan came to Islamic Foundation to give that Arabic class, and he actually had a joke about exactly that in there. He was talking about a time where he was like, yeah, I was in the masjid and I was in a hurry, so, after finishing the Fard, I got up to leave, and an uncle stops me, and he's like, hey, is Sunnah not Fard on you? and he's like, I didn't know what to say to that.
Nice.
Yeah, Nasr brings this subject up, though, in section 2 of this chapter. That's actually how he opens the second section here. He says, when one turns to the social, economic, and political domains of life, the most important point to note first of all is that most young Muslims are not able to distinguish between the authentic Islamic teachings, which have been incorporated to a large extent into the social structures of the part of the Muslim world in which they've grown up, and local customs and habits which also surround their life. And then one of the dangers you run into there is what happens when you meet people from, Muslims from other parts of the world, right, who grew up in a different cultural context. Are you going to start thinking that they're doing things wrong?
Probably the way that we're going. But I think, to sort of bring this back a second, if you don't understand what the basics are, then you can't understand why the basics are, right? You can't give a coherent explanation of why it is that you do things, because you have no clue why you do it. Because Islam says so. How do you know that? Because my parents said so? Okay, so your parents say so, not Islam says so. But the assumption is, well, my parents say that they're Muslims, so they gotta have it right. So not knowing things, we end up Like I've watched this. I've watched Muslim students argue for completely silly things, like women should not be educated. And then you go like, well, where the hell did like a third of your hadith come from? Because it's Aisha or the other wives of the Prophet. So that to me sounds like a lot of education, right? Like if you're able to teach people hadith, and as a starting point, that means that you know what you're talking about. That is education. But what's happening is they come from who knows where the local custom, at least as far as this person is aware, is that women don't go to school. And therefore, that must be what Islam says. And now they're out there, they're trying to argue this. And I had a colleague at the University of South Florida, and his favorite sort of one-liner was, I'd rather have a smart enemy than a dumb friend. Because the smart enemy forces you to become smarter, right? Mm-hmm. To properly engage. But a dumb friend undermines the both of you.
It drags you down.
Yeah. So that's that. Now imagine if that's what you understand Islam to be, then you come to America. Like, yeah, if that's how I understood Islam, I'd never be Muslim. If the Saudi interpretation of beating people on the streets kind of thing is how I understood Islam to be, why would I ever follow that? If the racist behavior that you see in places like the Gulf towards people that are of darker skin or of non-Arab heritage is what you understand Islam to be, then you have problems. But there is this lack of absolutely basic education, because if you have just the absolute lowest level, I would say, of Islamic education, you know that that's not what Islam is. Now, you might not know what it is, but you know what it isn't. At least that. So if you don't have any of that, and then you walk into a place where you are going to have like one person per class that's read like 2 books by Sam Harris, and they're going to be throwing out arguments, and you don't have a comeback because you have never been taught to think about this. Because the only thing you've been told is that you're supposed to feel Muslim. Well, then they're going to take their bad arguments, but still arguments, and they're going to beat you over the head with them. And you're going to come away with the idea that it's Islam that has a problem, not that you are ignorant and illiterate. So, like, as an absolute starting point, this core level of education needs to be something that Muslims are aware of, because at the very least, I feel like it gives you enough understanding to know that there are other fields and that there's a lot of depth to them, so that if you ever run into a problem that you can't deal with, you at least know that there are experts and these are the fields, and so now you know where to go. Otherwise, you're sort of stuck having to reinvent the wheel all on your own every single time.
Yeah, there's no requirement to become an expert in everything, but you should know at least a little something. And thanks to the information era that we live in, there's really no excuse to not be able to find someone who actually is an expert in that particular area and learn more from them.
So I think he continues after that. The next paragraph starts, he says, also, the young Muslim must learn enough of his own intellectual tradition to be able to draw from it responses to such modern and postmodern challenges as nihilism, agnostic or atheistic existentialism, materialistic Marxism, psychologization of the spiritual world and of spiritual reality as we see in so many different schools of psychology, as well as the challenges posed by modern science, and now, of course, the environmental crisis which threatens human existence itself. And then towards the end there, he says, only too often when a young Muslim comes to the West, even if he comes from a devout family and has been able to learn the rites of his religion and certain verses of the Quran and is pious, he has nevertheless not been taught his own intellectual tradition so as to be able to draw from it in the new situations when he faces which he faces from every quarter within the modern world. This holds true not only for those living in the West, but even for the young who live within the modernized circles in the Islamic world. And I think this is the sort of second part of this. If all you do is pick up the ritualistic faith of your parents, and let's say that they were absolutely wonderful people who themselves had been educated, but somehow they failed to educate you beyond you picking up what they do, they then have a lot of solutions, a lot of fiqhi solutions, a lot of interpreted solutions from the primary sources to a set of problems that they were facing. But if you have changed your context, which you have, by doing something like coming to the West, or just by living in the West, right? Because how different is 2021 from 1990?
Yeah.
Right? If you don't understand your intellectual tradition, you can't coherently, in that jurisprudential way, adjust the behavior set to match your context anymore. And so now you're just sort of stuck doing things that were valid when the context was A, but the context is no longer A, and so whoops.
Yeah, no, you can certainly see that there are times and places where you don't necessarily need all of that knowledge if you live in an Islamic context, like an Islamic country, and you plan on spending your life there, and you are also not worried about essentially cultural invasion. But we don't live in that world. No part of our world really has all of those qualities anymore, because everywhere is being invaded by Western culture.
But more to that point, like you're not planning on moving. My parents didn't plan on moving out of Bosnia. Was it 13 million Syrians did not plan on leaving their home, and yet there is no longer a home, and a whole lot of those people can't go back to Syria.
Yeah.
How many Libyans were intending to leave home? How many Egyptians? Like everywhere the Arab Spring went, right? Everywhere where you had a military invasion from abroad. So this, like, even if things don't change in your lifetime, there's a possibility that they're going to change in your children's lifetime. And if you're planning on having kids, you are responsible for being the primary educator. So this may be a skill set that you're never planning on using yourself. Like the society isn't changing. There's a lot of muftis around, right? Like they give you the answers and whatnot. But when you have this hyper strong emphasis on being able to understand what the religion is saying to you, right? Like what is it that God is communicating to you? I don't think you have the luxury of saying, oh no, I don't need to know this. To some extent, you have to know it. Because otherwise, all you need is like one idiot ruler to bring everything down. Because you go like, oh, well, the rulers, they know what they're talking about. Right? And if there's nobody to check them, whoops, now you have issues. Certainly wouldn't be the first time that's happened historically. But yeah, I think as just a last bit for me on this, the intellectual challenge isn't just somebody in your class or somebody at your work asking questions. The intellectual challenge is ultimately the fact that you have to live in a world and you have to be able to make sense of it. And I think we talked about this last lecture that we did, the idea of cost versus the return on investment. And if you don't understand what exactly the cost is and what exactly is it that you're getting back, the idea that you're just going to follow it becomes an incoherent idea, right? Especially because the cost is very tangibly real, and that investment, the return on investment, can't immediately be visible because, well, you have to wait to get the return at some later date. So I think the very act of just living forces you to face these sorts of problems, right? Like, how are you going to act when this comes up, when this other thing comes up, right? Like when you have these sorts of problems, those sorts of problems, when your kids come to you with their problems, if you don't have a decent intellectual basis for what it is that you're doing, you become incapable of answering questions that you are absolutely forced to answer. And whether it's through action or inaction, you are giving an answer to those questions one way or the other. Right? There is no sitting it out.
Yeah, one of the unfortunate ways that some people try to solve this, I think you discussed this, I don't know if it was in one of the classes or in one of our previous episodes, is essentially memorization, right? Okay, there were these criticisms. I'm going to memorize an answer for them. And if you're doing that and there's no basis, like no intellectual basis behind it, no real foundation there, then what happens when new ones come along, right? So we opened up this entire class with a discussion of critical thinking, and this is a big reason why we did, is because you have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be able to handle new things that come up. And one of the most enduring qualities of the West, at least right now, this culture that we live in, is that it is constantly changing. And so the big issues now, 20 years from now, they'll probably be treated like they're totally resolved. There's going to be a whole new set of issues. Are you going to be able to handle those? Are you going to be able to handle it's almost inevitable at some point in time here in the U.S., what's happening in places like Denmark or Belgium is going to make its way here, which is the one about slaughtering animals is cruel, right? That's not one you may think of very much, but it's going to happen. How are you going to be able to handle that one?
Can you give us Qurbani lab-grown meat?
Yeah, I mean we're kind of past some of these issues here, right? That have been big ones. Even something like issues regarding stem cells and stuff. And now we're moving on to those types of things. Do you have a good answer if people say to you, well, what does Islam have to say about cloning, whether it's animals or even people, right?
Yeah, and we don't really think about it.
Are you going to memorize the answers in advance and then expect to remember them? Or are you going to have some sort of a solid intellectual foundation combined with preferably like a group perhaps of scholars who you really trust and you know what they're talking about and who you can go to? Preferably at least one of which you could actually communicate with on your own, not just people that you're relying on YouTube videos of. Do you have someone you can go to ask these kinds of questions?
Well, that, for example, I think in and of itself sort of shows you the importance of having the basics down first. Because every dude with like a turban and a beard and a camera can be Sheikh whatever on YouTube, right? And the question is, well, how exactly do you tell the difference? Well, the basics, and this we talked about this in an actual class, but the basics are really heavily a matter of, let's say, core rational thinking principles, the ability to read, and then actually reading, right? And then, because if you can't do that, and even with a translation of a text, then I can decide to translate it or interpret it for you however it is that I feel, and it doesn't matter that it makes no sense. This dude with a turban and a beard said it, so it must be true. In fact, this is what we know for a fact happened in places like Afghanistan. There's Vice News, which they're kind of hit or miss these days, but if you...
Good starting premise. Lousy execution over the long run is how I would describe them.
But they had, like, in their early episodes, they were really good. So if you look up episode 1, and I think it's the second half of that episode, the guy who runs the organization, he actually goes to Afghanistan and he meets with the head of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. The guy actually gives him an interview, and the guy asks, he's like, well, how do you square the fact that the Quran prohibits murder, and here you are sort of blowing up civilians intentionally, right? And like that they're civilians, that for a fact that they haven't done anything wrong, and the guy goes like, oh, don't worry, we have a sheikh who gave us a fatwa. And like that fatwa shouldn't matter, right? That sheikh doesn't matter, because if you have basic critical thinking skills, and even if the only way you can access that text is through a translation, you look at that and you go like, nah, just nah, it doesn't work like that, right? Black is not white. So it's one of these things that needs to be a very basic starting point. You are responsible for you. And then you certainly have plenty of very traditional scholars whose works have been in fact translated. So even if you start off with the point of like, well, I don't know at all who to trust, you go to the oldest sources that you can. They have been decently translated, and you pick up those like core starting points, and then you can take a look at your varieties of bearded turban dudes on YouTube and find like which one of them actually knows what they're talking about, at least in the sense of like they're not contradicting the text itself. As a starting premise, like that should probably be an important point. Right? You can't be an Islamic scholar if the first words out of your mouth are a direct contradiction of everything the Quran says. Any more than you can be, I don't know, actually, no, never mind, I was going to compare it to a different religion, but I don't know whether that works these days anymore.
Yeah, I'm just remembering there was this was probably about 10 years ago that I heard this one first. There was some relatively young guy, he couldn't have been more than about 30, and he was starting to become somewhat popular with YouTube videos, and I'm pretty sure he was out of Saudi Arabia. He used to rail against Sufis quite a lot. And so at one point in time in one of his videos, he rails against the un-Islamic practice of certain Sufis in the West, and he lists guys like Hamza Yusuf and Zaid Shakir among the people who he's essentially condemning here. And their supposed offense is that they would raise their hands in dua. Like, this is a Sufi practice. And thankfully, I looked underneath it in the comments, because I'm not the type of person to comment in YouTube, but I was really tempted to that one time. But sure enough, there are at least a few people in there who are like, dude, there's hadith say outright that you could see the whites of the Prophet's armpits when he would raise his hands in dua. Like, how can you possibly square that? But, I mean, if you're talking to an audience that doesn't know those things and just trusts you to tell them everything, then they're going to believe you, that those horrible Sufis look at the practices that they do.
Yeah. There it is, by the way, authoritative sources. The moment you give up your own thinking and you hand over the use of reason to somebody else, and you go like, Bob will think for me, you are entirely relying on Bob's goodwill, Bob's good faith, Bob's intelligence, because if Bob makes a mistake, you just got dragged into a mistake right alongside him. And that's why you're not actually allowed to do that, right? And you have, oh man, I can't quote it directly, but if you, I don't know if you started reading the Principles of State and Governance in Islam by Muhammad Asad.
I haven't gotten to it yet.
So it's kind of a prime principle. You have this hadith that says something like, whoever is obviously the Prophet speaking, whoever is obedient to me is obedient to God, and whoever is obedient to the ruler that they have raised, among them, he is obedient to me. And when a ruler says to do something, it's your job to respond with, we hear and obey, unless something prohibited is ordered, at which point you're not allowed to either hear nor obey. And you go like, okay, but in order for that to work, you have to know what is and isn't prohibited. So you are never allowed to completely externalize your use of reason. It's always a thing that you are responsible for. Because you don't get to go like, well, Bob said it. It's like, well, did I not give you reason? Are you incapable of thinking through this yourself? So yeah.
So one question that people will raise at this point in time is, well, why do people do that? Why do people just externalize their thinking to others? The best answer I have is laziness.
Yeah, why do you use a calculator instead of, pen and pencil to do your math?
Well, I deal with that with my students all the time, right? I'll tell them, no, most of this you can actually do yourself, but they'd rather use the calculator.
It's faster, it's easier, they don't actually have to think. I mean, when you use a calculator, you're not actually doing math. You are doing object manipulation. And it's mechanical, and you don't have to actually think or know essentially anything other than the order of buttons which you're doing. So, ta-da, right? And yeah, we prefer to do things the easy way. And that's one thing. On the other hand, you do have the idea of like, well, I would rather hear from an expert, right, than just, sort of half-ass it on my own. So if I can find somebody who if I have a plumbing problem, yes, I could solve it myself. I could watch like 3 hours of YouTube, figure out roughly what I'm doing, and then go attempt that maneuver myself. Or I could call a plumber, on the assumption that the plumber is an expert who will do a better job than I will. But if a plumber comes to my home and takes a look at a cracked toilet and then tells me that we need to, replace the warp coils and reverse the polarity, and then it's going to cost me $15,000, I need to have enough common sense to go like, nah, thank you, right? Because that's not what toilets do, and that's a bunch of Star Trek jargon.
Well, that's why mechanics overcharge women. They think they can get away with it because they expect them to have less knowledge of the car. They can just say, oh yeah, we need to do this thing too, and this thing too, and it's like, okay.
Well, and I mean, in that case, you end up being right? You think you can overcharge this segment of your population, let's say on a more regular basis than you can a different segment of your population, because they're less likely to know about it. And if you manage to keep overcharging them, then you were right. You apparently can, because if you got called out on your BS and then you lost customers, then obviously that would have been a practice that would not be sustainable. But if it's a thing that happens commonly, obviously it works.
One of the interesting things, though, that ties the calculator example and the plumber example together, at least when the plumber's doing things right, is that they're both mechanical, right? It's basically follow this process, get this outcome. And it's one thing to outsource that. It's another thing to outsource your thinking, though.
Well, yeah, but I mean, in both of those cases, you still have to outsource your thinking. When you're doing math with a calculator, it's possible that you hit a wrong button, right? Now, if you have somebody who entirely isn't thinking about the problem before them, they have no clue what the answer would be. They're not even ballparking it in their head after they look at it, and they'll take whatever the calculator gives them and put it down as an answer, right? You, on the other hand, you look at the problem and you're like, okay, I'm looking for a value that's roughly in this neighborhood. And then if your calculator gives you something that's 1,000 times larger, you get to go like, hold up. What did I do wrong here? And then you go back and check. So if my plumber tells me that a toilet is, let's say replacing a toilet, is somewhere between $100 and $200, okay, ballpark, in the right neighborhood. If he tells me that it's $1,000, like, that should at least catch my attention enough to go like, hold up, how did you get there? Right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by you can't completely externalize, not even on mechanical things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you're talking about I refer to as having a BS alarm in your head.
There you go.
I noticed that one of the things you should get out of a college education, especially one that has any liberal arts grounding in it at all, is you should be getting a stronger BS alarm, right? Even if you don't know what the actual answer is. If someone comes out with a study making some claim that is totally ridiculous, you're going to at least be able to look at that and say, no, I think something's wrong here. Or to use another example, this happens in the news all the time. If news story comes out that says that this horrible thing just happened somewhere in the country, or even possibly somewhere overseas, judge let such and such person off the hook for this horrible crime, and all the responses are, that was a horrible injustice. And I look at that and I'm like, well, I mean, I have some grounding in law thanks to a degree in political science and taking a bunch of law classes. I look at that and I say, no, something's got to be wrong here. And so it's happened before that I put in the effort, right? I actually found the case. And in some cases, thankfully, like, the actual, like, opinions are written out of the judges, especially if it's like a Supreme Court case or something really high up. And you look at it and you're like, okay, that's not at all what just happened there. That's not at all what was said. Or in some cases, you look at it and you're like, yeah, the outrage is the result of misrepresentations of what happened. If you know what actually happened, then you're like, no, that was actually the right decision to make in that situation. But if you're outsourcing all of your thinking, then you're basically taking that little BS alarm in the back of your head and you're turning it to off, and you're letting someone else do the feel outraged part for you, and then you're like, yes, I will now feel outraged.
Well, I'm seeing these headlines that go like, why you should be outraged about X. And it's like, hold on a second.
They're not even hiding it anymore.
Like, if you read the story and you felt outraged, maybe you should feel outraged. Maybe, right? But the fact that somebody has to go like, feel outraged at this is a pretty good indication that you would not have felt outraged otherwise, right? So, like, they're so blatantly trying to push your buttons that it's kind of sad. And in fact, in my philosophy classes, this is one of the first things we do in those courses, is we talk about how easy it is to emotionally manipulate people if they allow themselves to keep emotionally reacting to input. And the easiest thing, I use this as a practical example if I'm arguing with somebody, and they're very obviously winning the point. I don't want to stay on that point, right? Because that's I'm losing, so I don't want to play that game. I need to change the game. It's obviously not in their interest to change the game because they're winning. So what do I have to do? I have to trick them into leaving their very strong and secure position and coming over onto shaky ground where I might win. And so if I always pick a girl in the class for the example just because it makes it easier. I go like, let's say, whatever, Stephanie here is wiping the floor with me in a debate, and I wait for her to finish her statement, and then I follow it up with something like, psh, that's what a woman would say. And if she takes the bait, then all of a sudden we're no longer talking about the thing where she was winning. Now she, like, if I can really push her buttons and she starts screaming, now she looks like a crazy person, despite her position being significantly better in the debate. And that's what we do, right? Like, when you're losing, you try to provoke the other person into losing their mind so that they stop winning, right? That's it's a sort of a Hail Mary of debate tactics, but sometimes it's all you have. And in fact, the Trump-Hillary debate had an amazing moment of this, and I couldn't believe that people fell for it, right? Trump gets asked about when is he going to release his tax records. This is back in 2016. And I'm like, ooh, right? Like, he's on the spot. What's he going to do? And he replies with, well, what about Hillary's emails?
Yeah.
And I'm like, all you have to do is just go like, we'll get to that, but we ask you about your taxes, right? And you win. But no, she falls for it, and for the next 10 minutes, instead of talking about Trump's tax returns, she's sort of backpedaling on the emails, and you're like, oh, it's hard to watch, because she literally snatches defeat from the jaws of victory. right? And that's what happens when you're sort of emotionally vulnerable in that way, right? Like if you keep responding to things. So I can then throw, it doesn't matter whether the information is true or not. I can keep throwing things at you that make you feel outraged, and I can just sidetrack you from the thing that actually matters. And now we're having a discussion that has nothing to do with the actual topic. So it's a very dangerous thing, and it's literally the first thing that we cover in my classes. Like, do not fall for this. You are smarter than this.
And the topic of outrage is an important one, both for just talking about the modern lifestyle in general, and also for this week's topics as well, because outrage has become such, unfortunately, an integral part of our society and the way that people communicate with one another. Somewhere along the way, various organizations like BuzzFeed and such figured out that that was the way to get the most clicks. And then the mainstream media followed along with them, because if they didn't follow along, they were the ones who were going to fall behind. And now that's the go-to. And headlines are even written in these ways that are designed to get that reaction, even when the actual substance, even when the substance is right there, like in the first paragraph or two, right underneath it, contradicts whatever it was that would make you feel outraged in the first place. But again, going back to the subject of laziness, a lot of people don't even bother to look beyond the initial headlines there.
All right. So the sort of second part that I'd like to get to on this chapter, and it's actually related to the first one. It's on pages 244 and then 245. So 244 towards the bottom, it's the last full paragraph, about halfway down. It reads, "The modernist attacks made against the traditional family structure, relation between the sexes, the rapport between various generations, and the like in the Islamic world must not be accepted passively and with a sense of inferiority by young Muslims as if they were established truths or scientifically established criteria of judgment. On the contrary, every few decades, fashions and criteria for judgment that emanate from the West change. In fact, such criticisms must be viewed as issuing from a worldview which is totally alien to that of Islam, from a society which itself is in the process of rapid change and in danger of dissolution." And then on the next page, as a matter of fact, every few decades there is a new goal of certain types of agnostic or atheistic moralists in the modern world who need what would appear to be a moral cause in order to survive in a world in which they have forgotten God, but a moral cause which has no objective criteria based on revelation and the divine law, but which is based on purely human constructs that, therefore, change with the rapidity of change in human beings immersed in a whirlpool of rapid transformation bordering on chaos. Now, the way I like to think of this is that first topic that we covered is the need for intellectual grounding in Islam. And then the second part here is the ethical grounding. And you can't work out the ethical grounding without first having a solid basis in the sort of core Islamic intellectual grounding, because ethics is an intellectual activity, right? So if you want to be able to deal with this kind of thing, which touches on everything from outrage to economics to political systems, you have to start with like core Islamic things, which also includes critical thinking and the study of the basic sciences of Islam.
Yeah, one thing that stood out to me here, from a practical standpoint, let's say for the sake of argument that you are a young man who has become unmoored thanks to this society, right? You've kind of lost your way, but you're trying to find your way again. You're trying to figure out what is the right way of living. And you have two choices for who you are going to turn to for advice. Do you turn to the person whose life is a mess? The person who, I don't know, let's say they're not praying. they don't really follow the other, requirements for being a good Muslim. Their money, their financial situation is in complete disarray. They don't have a good relationship with their parents. Or do you turn to someone who's got it figured out? Someone who's got a solid grounding in Islam, someone who's got a good job, is married, is starting a family, because you're looking for a role model here, so it's probably going to be someone older than you. In essence, who do you pick as your role model? And I think the answer is pretty obvious here. You pick the person who's got it together. And the issue with Western society is that Western society kind of functions like the guy who on the surface maybe looks like he's got it together, but once you dig beyond that very surface veneer, is actually a total disaster.
So
kind of like a high-functioning alcoholic.
I was going to say like an Instagram model.
Yeah, but I was sticking with guys here. But yes, that would be a good example for women. Yeah, so I mean, who do you turn to in that situation? It should be obvious. And the problem that we seem to have, and he points it out when he says, this society is in the process of rapid change and in danger of dissolution. Why are you taking this society as your basis for determining what is right and wrong? Because if you are, then that's no different than trying to get life advice from a high-functioning alcoholic who's in debt up to his eyeballs just so that he can impress the Joneses.
Yeah, I think it's well, here's the thing, right? And I think he should have actually addressed this in some of these earlier chapters, right? What the West does well is materialism. What Islam says is that materialism is the exact wrong way of doing things. Yes, of course you need some portions of materialism, right? And those sorts of concerns, but that can't be the only thing. So the reason why you would be taking advice from the West is if you haven't properly understood the Islamic position, right? And now you think that the West is somehow the standard setter for everything, instead of going like, ooh, they did, let's say, materialistic science right, or they did it well at least. Let's copy that. And instead you're going like, whatever they did, let's copy that. And you know that that's not a functional approach to anything, right? You can't blindly just sort of accept everything that a society has done and run forth with it.
And it's made worse by the fact that a lot of leaders in the Muslim world, I don't want to necessarily call them Muslim leaders here, but a lot of leaders in the Muslim world have essentially taken that position, right? We are inferior versions of the West. Let's try to be more like them.
And not even in the, oddly enough, not even in the relevant ways. What you see is a lot of like, ooh, they wear fancy clothes, we're gonna buy fancy clothes too. Not like, hey, look at the size of the investment into education which made them possible. Let's do that. Or, hey, one of the things that America definitely does very well, and the sort of traditional Islamic empires also did very well, is sort of absorb everybody who is of any value and put them to work in that field, right? But like, no, we're not going to do that, right? We're not going to build up these institutions of higher education that are going to then, like in a generation or three, propel the nation forward. Like that, like if you want to copy the West, copy that, right? Copy some of the free market principles. Why did Elon Musk move to the US instead of to Qatar? And you can look at that and go like, well, people like Elon Musk are highly beneficial to the societies that they're in. Why are we not attracting people like that? And then figure out a way to attract people like that, right? That would be, let's say, at least functional copying of the West. But instead you have this like passive acceptance of the idea of something like the only way to be successful is to do a bunch of haram stuff. So we're just going to mimic the outward effects of this, right? The way we dress, the planes that we fly, and things like that. But we are not going to engage in any of it. We're just going to sit here and religiously act as if we're living in the 14th century, but drive on some spinning rings. So it's a little, well, I mean, right there, the critical thinking part has to be missing in order to engage in that. But I want to sort of hop into this idea of all the things that are sort of on the table on that page 244, right? He's talking about the attacks against traditional family structure, relation between sexes, rapport between the generations, all the rest of this. The idea that what the West does must be the right way to do it is a problem. And you buy into that only if you look to the West as if they have all of their stuff together, right? So you're not sort of seeing the alcoholic part of the high-functioning alcoholic. And then you're sort of stuck having to answer, like, well, why can't you just sort of have a lack of marital structure in a society? And you sort of get stuck trying to figure out the answer to that if you didn't understand why that ought to be the case to begin with. Right? And we just sort of have this, like, wishy-washy. It's like, oh, it's what the prophet said. It's like, hold on, he didn't just say it to say it, right? The same way that as you read the varieties of stories in any religious text, they're not just stories to fill up the space, right? There's a moral behind them. There's a thing you're supposed to learn by reading them. So if you don't understand that, if you don't have the intellectual background, then you can't understand the ethical importance of these things. And you can't understand the relative importances as you move sort of through different contexts and different societies, right? Like, sake of argument, what is more important? Getting, if these are your two options, getting meat which is officially halal, as in like it was slaughtered halal, but which, while the animal was alive, was wildly mistreated, right? Essentially the same factory farming, and then the guy who hits the start button on the conveyor belt says a Bismillah before he pushes the button, or having animals that were properly taken care of their entire lives. Let's say you get your meat from the Amish, but like they do the slaughtering, right? Which one of those is more acceptable? Humane treatment of animals while they're alive, or inhumane treatment with a Bismillah at the end? And it sounds a little funny. You're like, well, why are you stuck making your choices between A and B there? Isn't there more choices? Thankfully now there is. But there wasn't for a while, right? And a lot of these supposed halal meat companies didn't feel like they needed to do any of that because, well, one, they had cornered the market. So I guess we'll learn something about economics, namely the monopoly section part of it. But the other part was nobody was asking that question, because all they cared about, like, nobody sort of like read the entire thing. Nobody went like, oh, what is ethical meat according to Islam? And we hadn't thought of it. And of course we didn't, because in order to think about that, you have to be able to take the core ideas and then properly structure them and arrange them in a little hierarchy, and then apply them to your context and see what does and doesn't work, and then work out things. But all of that needs effort, and all of that needs at least a core basic of understanding of what it is that you're looking at. And if we don't provide that to the next generation, then there's absolutely no reason why they would view the, let's say, the traditional position on these ideas as anything other than just some old superstitions. Because it's not like those traditional answers were easy to come by, right? Civilization spent forever trying to like figure it out and get it right, and Go like, oh, okay, this is why this is important. We tried it the other way, almost collapsed the whole society. Our bad. We're back to the original, right? So it's not the sort of thing you can easily find out for yourself. You have to go read it. You have to go think about it. And if you're being lazy anyway, as we found out that everybody is, then you're not going to find out, and you're going to find that it's a lot easier and a lot sort of functional for being lazy to just nod your head along with whatever the majority of people around you say. So if today a family unit is important, then you're going to nod your head along with that. And if tomorrow we say no, the family unit is the worst thing that's ever happened, then you're going to nod along with that, and ta-da, there you go. In terms of the of that page 245, that's the end part of what I read. I'll link to the video, which I believe I've already linked for another thing. But this idea of right and wrong, like we still keep pitching that, right? We go like, it's wrong to do X, and you go like, well, how do you know? Like, what is your standard of claiming that? And you go, well, it feels wrong. It's like, cool. What if it feels right to me? Right? Like, if you don't have an external standard, then whatever you feel is perfectly fine. And as we covered in class, what you feel isn't up to you. And it's subject to change without reason at any moment. But I'm assuming that most Germans were normal people. And then most Germans were Nazis. And most Russians were normal people, and then, gulags. And most Chinese were normal people, and then, like, eradication of the Chinese people in the tens of billions. And most Japanese were normal people, and then the rape of Nanking. And most Rwandans were normal people, and then the genocide, right? Like, you can't assume that you're going to keep feeling the way you are. The question isn't, why would you do terrible things? The question is, why would you not do terrible things when you can get away with it? And you feel like it. And eventually something will push you to feel like it. Like somebody will cut you off on the highway, and it'll be just you and them, and you'll go like, I bet I can drive you off the road, jackass. And then, like, why wouldn't you? And in fact, we see this in Florida a whole bunch, people waving guns at each other through car windows, because, Florida man. But the question is, if you have a gun, and you're going to sort of get away with it, why wouldn't you?
Yeah. You have to have a why that is separate from the question, will I get punished for this? Punished right now, of course.
Yeah.
Will I get caught right now?
And I think if you're stuck with that, then there's always a chance that you can get away with it, right? Because cops and the IRS and whoever else that might be watching you might not see it. And so if the only reason why you won't speed is because you're going to get a speeding ticket, well, then as soon as I give you one of those like little radar jammer detector things in your car, you no longer have a reason not to speed. Right? It will detect when when there is a police officer trying to tag you.
Sure.
It will prevent them from tagging you, and then you can slow down before they can sort of visually confirm your speed, kind of thing. So now you can speed it essentially as much as you like. I mean, if Harvey Weinstein could have got away with it, would it have been okay? That's essentially the question. Because if your worry is the immediate sort of physical punishment, then the answer is yes, he would have been okay. That would have been the right thing to do. How do you know? Because he got away with it. Mm-hmm. He did what he felt like, and there were no consequences.
And if you don't have an objective grounding for your morality, or a universal objective grounding for your morality, there is no way for you to actually make a solid argument for why it would be wrong.
All you can say is that you feel like it's wrong. I feel like eating okra is terrible. Like, absolutely atrocious. It's a form of, like, torture for me. But you're sort of down to that level of preference. And at that point, like, I can say I don't like okra. I can't really say you shouldn't eat okra. I mean, I could, insofar as I was able to physically prevent you from eating okra and violently beat you for attempting to. Right? And in that case, welcome to the authoritarian regime, because you just run off of the preferences of your glorious leader. So it's trippy there. I'll put the link in the description. I spend about 25 minutes sort of running down exactly what happens if you take this approach where you don't have an external point to ground your ideas in, and with a bunch of examples and all that sort of stuff. Yes, amongst the amongst the closing lines of the book, he says, at the heart of this enterprise, so the entire book, lies the preservation of Iman, that is, the faith in Allah, His omnipotence, omniscience, and love for those who submit themselves to Him, as well as faith in His word, the noble Quran, and the teachings which emanate through His final prophet. It must never be forgotten that the Quran and the Hadith, the twin sources of the Islamic tradition, provide all the guidance of which Muslim, young and old, are in need now or in the future to the end of history. And I just sort of like to throw a little bit here of disambiguating the point. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing you read and then you're done. What it does mean is that idea of purpose, of telos, the thing that will give you your why, that will govern everything else and explain everything else, it is in those sources. Right? You can get further clarification and explanation and your questions answered through secondary sources and whatever else. But ultimately, the whole sort of point of the entire book has been this idea of driving at the idea of you having a purpose. As a human being, all human beings have the same ultimate purpose. And if you can get that right, then everything else sort of falls in place around it, because that purpose is what will give meaning to everything else that you do, and it makes all the sacrifice and cost paying now meaningful in the long term, and the sort of thing that you're going to do actually out of let's call it a rational self-interest, to do some Adam Smith here at the end, right? So if you understand things properly in terms of what is the world, who are you, and how those things come together appropriately, that relationship, which is described primarily in the Quran and the Hadith, that is the thing that you need to focus on. And to understand that, you need this basic level of critical thinking and studies of Islamic sciences, so that you can adequately make sense of it. That's my sort of concluding thing on it.
Right. I think you said this before. I don't know if any of the videos or just one of our conversations. The idea that if you have a strong why, you can endure any how.
Yeah, that's Nietzsche.
Right? Well,
of all the things, that's Nietzsche.
Well, it's right, because one of the main purposes, as you just said with the book, is to get people to understand what that why is, right? Because you have to know what the why is, what the purpose is. You have to decide that it's worth it to put the effort into achieving that purpose. And when you've done that, then you can get to the point where you say, okay, now how do I do that? And then if that why is strong, right, you establish it's strong, you establish that it's worth it to do this, then the how starts becoming easier to see and to actually implement.
All right, I think that's about it. We're at an hour 5, and that actually concludes our read-through of the entire text. Maybe if you're up for it, we could do the principles of Islamic state and governance, by Muhammad Assad. Next, that one's actually, I think, shorter than this by almost 100 pages, which is kind of funny because it's the entire constitution of an Islamic state and an explanation for it. Either way, if we do throw something else up, you guys will see it. That's it. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or anything else, you can leave it in the comments or send us an email. And until next time, this has been Dr. Farid Rahmanovich and Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.